Hey, this is Jay from Greenbriar Studio, and in this video I'm going to discuss the drum processing I did in a song that I just finished mixing. I'm going to play a few seconds of the drums by themselves so you can hear where they ended up by the end of the mix, and then I will break it all down to show you how I got the individual sounds and how I blended them together. So here we go. I like to start with overheads when I'm mixing drums. When I first opened this session, the overheads sounded like this. By the way, the song was recorded live, so you can actually hear crowds singing in the overhead mics, which I think is really cool. I started with Slate Virtual Console Collection. I put it all the way across the drums, and for this particular song I used the Brit in, the Neve setting. It sounded great for this song, so first I put that on. I kind of used it as a gain staging. I took off about 9 dB. Then I started to EQ. I like to get a good overall picture of the drums, kind of think of it as a sound that you could get and actually use for the whole drum kit. I've never actually had to do that before, but in this particular case, I started out that way, but then realized I needed to brighten it up a lot to pull the cymbal sound up in it. So I added the API at 15K. And then added the VEQ. Sounds pretty drastically different from the way it was originally. I actually cranked about 7 dB, a shelf at 10K, and I took out a little bit on the bottom end. I don't like to do much higher than that because a lot of times I get a lot of good snare body out of the overheads. So I just decided to leave that in. Okay, so once I have the overheads, then I'll start to bring in the close, like the top snare mic and the kick inside mic, and I will check the phase with the overheads on kick, snare, and all of the toms. So I will bring in the top snare. Just to give you an example of the phasing, I've flipped this one. I'm gonna turn it back off so you can hear the difference. If you can hear, the snare sound just gets a lot thinner. I've seen a lot of videos and read a lot of articles that say, you know, if you've got a top and a bottom snare mic, make sure you flip the phase of the bottom snare mic. And while I agree that one of those needs to be flipped, a lot of times I end up needing to flip the top one and leave the bottom one alone because that's how the top snare mic works best with the overheads. Let me play what the snare sounded like before I did any processing on it. I'm going to go ahead and leave the virtual console on. First thing I did was add a gate. This is just working like an expander. Still kind of letting ghost notes through a little bit, not really slamming the gate down hard. There was a ring in the snare that I wanted to tame a little bit at about 400 hertz, and so I did that. Then with this EQ, I really brightened it up and added a lot of body at the bottom of it. Started like shelf at 180. I've recently joined the school of thought that just grab an EQ and crank it until it sounds the way you want it to. I used to be scared to do that for some reason, like don't do more than 4 dB on any EQ. I don't know why, but I don't really do that anymore. After that EQ, I did a little bit of compression, tightening it up a little bit, Then I add this SPL Attacker, which is a transient designer. Just adding a lot of punch. Again, with the overhead, sounds like this. They seem to blend really well. Then I did overhead and kick drum, the inside kick mic. What the kick sounded like when I got it was this. This is another example of a place where I did extreme EQ. A shelf at 7K, some at 3K, and scooped a lot out at 150. This particular kick drum has some interesting low-mid kind of things that just don't really work well. And then cranked at 50 to get some low end out of the kick drum. Then I added a little bit of compression on this kick drum. It really doesn't do much except for really hard hits. It started to take some of the low end out when I compressed too much. And then again, the transient designer, the attacker, to add a little bit of oomph to it. Once I get the kick in and the snare top blended with the overheads the way I like, then I start to bring in the other mics for each of those. So I'll start with the kick. This was the outside mic. For this one, I made an EQ curve like that, which basically I'm only grabbing 60 hertz for a little extra, sub frequencies. And then I rolled off at about 400, still giving some mid-range meat to see if that would work. Together, those sound like this. This song actually did not use a snare bottom microphone, and I kind of came up with this a few months ago. I really like having a snare bottom microphone, mainly because it brings out a lot of nuance in the snare drum, like ghost notes, and if there's a build, hearing that snare buzz kind of emphasizes the build, like it gives it away that, there's building, even if you may not be able to quite hear the top snare mic yet. It also just gives this cohesive sound to the whole kit because, if you hit the kick drum or toms, you still get a little bit of snare buzz. And so I figured out a way to do that even when I don't have a bottom snare mic. This is actually an aux track, and if you see all of these SNB sends up here, those are all sending signal from drums, the toms, the snare, and the kick to this snare bottom auxiliary track. And on that aux track, I have the Slate Trigger plugin with a sample that I recorded multiple velocities of the bottom of one of my snare drums. I just drag that in here by itself. It sounds like this. Nothing really special. Then I have this time adjuster to make it a little bit later, kind of to emulate a real bottom snare mic a little bit later than the top. And then this EQ is actually how I typically EQ a bottom snare mic, adding a little brightness around 10K. So with the snare and kick, it sounds like this. Without. Right now it sounds a little funky because it's loud. Once I get all the processing in, the balance will be better. This is where it ended up by the end of the mix. At this point, I usually decide whether I'm going to add any samples or not. In this case, I used kick and snare samples to augment the sound. I'll start with the kick. It sounds like this. This is a sample from the Icons pack from That Sound Drums. It's awesome stuff. I used the kick and the snare samples that I used for this song. I leaned on them also for a little bit of room sound. This particular recording originally had crowd microphones that were going to give me some really fun room drum sound to work with, but unfortunately there was something wrong with them and I didn't get to use them. So I'm relying on these samples that have these room channels kind of in the sample preset that sound like this. I use those to get a bigger, just a bigger sound. It helps so much to have that room sound. On this sample, I did a little bit of EQ. I took out some low end because the microphones on the actual kick drum already had plenty of low end, so blended in, it just sounds like that. Without it, just adds a ton of life. It's not relying totally on the sample, but it's adding a lot of stuff that I really like to have in there. I actually boosted 300 on this sample to add a little more mid-range. This is something I usually never do, but it sounded good for this. Let's check out the snare sample. All right. Again, this awesome room sound does a ton. One quick thing to mention, once you get the phase lined up with overheads, snare, kick, toms, then go through and make sure if you're adding samples, blending samples in, check the phase on those too. When I first brought in this snare sample, I checked the phase and it sounded okay. Just to make sure, I flipped it over, and all of a sudden the low end was totally gone, so I realized it was good the way it was. So on this sample, I also added this SPL attacker for a little bit of just a little extra punch. Did that for both the real snare and the sample. At this point, I started to bring in the hi-hat and toms. Hi-hat really, I didn't do anything special to. I rolled off a little at 100. It actually sounds dark, and I'm okay with that because you get a lot of bright sound out of this overhead channel. For the toms, I pretty much did identical processing with a few changes. I use expanders like on the snare drum just to keep cymbal bleed out. This particular plugin, I really like the sidechain function up here. It just lets me dial in exactly what frequencies it needs to look for the toms and helps knock out some of that cymbal noise and other bleed. You get a little bit in there, but it's fine. So then I moved on to the EQ for the toms. On this first tom, I added some 3K for some attack and boosted a lot around 150, cut around 400. I also added the attacker on all of the toms, and for the panning, I don't always do hard left and right, but in this case, it worked well to have the first one left, middle one in the center, and the third one all the way to the right. Sounded good, blended with the overheads. For this floor tom, there's a lot of floor tom work in this song, and I wanted a little extra girth on it, so I put the Waves R-Bass plugin on it, which generates some really nice low end. Let's see, there's a good spot. Without it, it's really thin. I just couldn't quite get what I wanted out of it with EQ by itself. So that's how that worked out. I'm going to play the drums by themselves again now, but without these parallel channels. I'll get to that in a minute. Once I got that balance, I went to my drum bus, and on here, again, I have the virtual console. Then this insert is actually a piece of hardware. It's an SSL G compressor, and without the compressor, it sounds like this. With the compressor, back out and in. Just adds a little bit of snare punch, keeps everything tight together. Then I moved on to parallel compression bus, which is a major help in getting thick drum tones. On this parallel compression bus, I'm sending all of these. It looks like everything except hi-hat is going to parallel compression. This is a pair of Empirical Labs distressors on the parallel compression chain. That's the signal being sent, and with the compressors engaged, it's a pretty major change. Obviously, you don't have to have distressors or a G compressor to do any of the things I just did, but it's inspiring for me to use hardware, and it's fun, and I like the sound of it. So blended in, it sounds like this. Without it, obviously it's adding some volume, but you're getting a lot of sustain too. It really brings out the room tones on these kick and snare samples, which is awesome. Next is kind of a new thing that I've been doing for drums. This Aphex plugin from Waves. I just started putting that on a parallel bus for drums. By itself, this is what it sounds like. This is set up in their auxiliary mode here. It's really just the top end of everything. It just adds this kind of sparkle, clarity kind of thing that I usually can't get out of just EQ. Blended in, it sounds like this. Without it, with it, it's just unique. It adds a brightness that's not harsh, and I have everything. Every drum channel is being sent to that. The overheads I dialed back a little bit, and the hi-hat, that blend worked well. Another thing I did was set up these kind of fake room channels. It's basically reverb, but I did a few special things to them to kind of emulate a room sound. For this first one, actually both of these, I sent all of the drum channels in. The first one I started with is a mono channel to emulate a mono room mic. This is a Lexicon reverb called Slammin' Room, and you can hear why it's called that. I add some EQ, taking off some highs for some distance, and cutting some lows to make sure that it's not boomy and out of control. And then my favorite thing to do to room mics is crush them. So it's all buttons in, fastest attack and fastest release, and it sounds like this. This EQ I put on the end in case I needed to do any more tone shaping, and I didn't. So blended in with the rest of the kit, the mono room mic emulation sounds like this. Without it, with it. It's subtle, but it just adds a little bit more dimension, depth to the sound, a little bit longer tail on the snare. Now I'm going to move on to the stereo version of that. For this, I actually used the IR1 convolution reverb. That's what it sounds like. Added some EQ, tame it a little bit, then crushing it with the compressor. Again, just gain control. Then I added the stereo width plugin, make it a little bit wider, and all of those together sound like this. Without the reverb. Back in. It's just a little more excitement. When I got done with this mix, I soloed the drums again, and hearing them by themselves, I honestly thought they sounded a little bit over the top, like I did too much. But really, I'm happy with the way that they ended up pushing through the mix. With everything else in, they don't sound over the top. I'll play a little bit so you can hear what I'm talking about.